I never planned to tell this story. For years I carried it in silence, buried under the weight of secrecy and fear. But silence corrodes like rust eating through steel, and the memories refuse to die. They visit me in fragments, a sound, a smell, the flicker of something moving where no one should be. And when they come, it's as though I'm standing there all over again, in the heart of Yellowstone, where the ground itself seemed to know we were intruders. My name doesn't matter now. What matters is what I saw, what I was forced to do, and the price every man in my unit paid for obeying orders that should never have existed. Back then, in the summer of 1994, I was a soldier in a unit no one outside classified channels was supposed to know about. On paper, we were listed as part of an environmental response group, a harmless title meant to blend into the bureaucratic noise of government files. In truth, we were something else entirely. Our mission was not to protect forests or rivers. It was to track, contain, and remove whatever the rest of the world insisted did not exist. We called them NDSs, non-documented humanoids. It sounds clinical, like a line item on a laboratory ledger, but the public knows them by other names. I don't have to list them. You've heard the stories, whispered in campfire circles, repeated in late-night radio calls. Legends, people say myths, accept legends. Don't tear open tents like paper or leave footprints the length of a man's arm. Legends don't breathe down your neck when the woods go still. That August, a group of 4 hikers went missing near Shoshone Lake. Rangers found their camp, or rather what was left of it. The tents weren't shredded like a bear had clawed through them. They were ripped as though giant hands had seized the fabric and wrenched it apart. Food supplies were crushed flat, pans bent in half as if they were tin toys. The hikers themselves were gone. Not a trace left but a pattern of footprints in the damp earth near the waterline. Bare footprints shaped like human feet, but grotesquely oversized. 17 inches at least, maybe more. When the call reached us at Fort Carson, the response was immediate. We were airborne within hours. An 8-man team ferried by Chinook into the backcountry where tourists never wander. I still remember the thud of the rotors fading as the helicopter lifted away, leaving us in that silence that didn't feel like silence at all. It felt like the woods were watching, weighing us, deciding whether to let us pass. Major Grant led the operation, a hard man carved from years of secrets and shadows. He rarely spoke more than he had to. We were briefed quickly. Our target was presumed male, highly aggressive, and larger than anything we had ever trained for. The rules of engagement were clear. We were not there to kill unless absolutely necessary. Capture was the mission. Our weapons reflected that. Alongside our carbines, each of us carried Palmer pneumatic dart rifles, heavy devices that fired hypodermic syringes instead of bullets. The doses inside were tailored for nightmares. A chemical storm meant to drop, an elephant in seconds. For this mission, the dose was tripled. That detail alone told us what command expected we'd face. We began tracking at dusk. The air was sharp with the mineral tang of sulfur rising from nearby hot springs, mixed with the resin of wet pines. The ground was soft and dark, swallowing our footsteps. Through night vision and thermal scopes, we scanned the ridges and valleys, moving like ghosts through the trees. At first, all we saw were the familiar heat signatures of elk and deer, but the forest was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with animals. It's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. Imagine standing in a room you've known all your life, and suddenly every object in it is turned an inch to the left. Nothing obvious, nothing you can point to, but your body knows. Your skin prickles, your stomach knots, and you feel like a trespasser in your own home. That's how the forest felt. Every owl, every coyote, every frog had gone silent in unison, as though they'd agreed to hide. We knew then we weren't alone. The second night, Corporal Diaz caught something on the thermal scope. A heat signature massive, standing motionless at 200 meters, partly shielded by a pine trunk. At first glance it might have passed for a man, but the scale betrayed it. Nearly 10 feet tall, shoulders as broad as a doorway, its body pulsing red-orange against the cool blues of the forest. The major whispered orders into our coms, his voice steady but tight. We split into 2 groups, circling like wolves to box it in. I crept forward, every step a negotiation with branches that seemed eager to betray me. At 70 meters, I could see the outline without optics, a figure too large, too still, blending with the tree like a shadow carved from stone. My chest hammered. My hands trembled, though I'd trained years for this, because training doesn't prepare you for the moment. When myth breathes in front of you, the order to fire never came. Just as Grant raised his hand, the figure slid behind a rock outcrop and was gone. No sound, no branch snapping, no trace on the soil. Vanished as if the earth had swallowed it. I'll never forget the way the major muttered into the silence, almost to himself, "It's toying with us." On the third night, we stopped chasing and set a trap. A narrow ravine with a stream cutting through, flanked by sheer walls, a place where anything moving through would have to expose itself. We lay in wait for hours, the cold gnawing into our bones, breath fogging the lenses of our scopes. Time stretched until it felt unreal. Then, around 3 in the morning, the shape emerged. It didn't sneak. It walked openly down the stream, its massive arms swinging, head turning with the calm assurance of a predator that has never known fear. Moonlight struck its fur, coarse and dark, and for the first time I saw its face clearly. Heavy brow, deep-set eyes glinting like wet stone. It crouched to drink from the stream. The sound of water against its cupped hand was the loudest thing in the world. Grant gave the signal. Darts hissed through the air, striking its back and thigh. I expected it to collapse. Instead, the forest exploded with a roar that rattled the ground. It tore the darts free, bellowing a sound that felt older than language, then charged uphill, straight toward us. Branches cracked like gunfire as it came. We fired again, more darts slamming into its chest and shoulder. Still it barreled forward, crashing through saplings, a storm of muscle and rage. My mouth filled with the taste of copper, and in that moment I knew we were prey. We pursued blindly, heartbeats louder than gunshots, until at last the chemicals began to drag it down. We found it on a clearing slope, slumped against a boulder, chest heaving like a bellows. Its eyes followed us, black pools holding not just fury but something else, a weight I still can't name. As Grant injected a final dose directly into its neck, I swear I saw understanding in its gaze, as though it recognized what we were and why we had come. Then the lids lowered, heavy and reluctant, and it slipped into silence. The helicopter came an hour later. We loaded the body into a reinforced container under floodlights that made the forest look like a stage. And as the rotors carried it into the sky, none of us spoke. There was no celebration, only a hollow heaviness that settled in our chests like wet cement. That was the night I learned the world was wider and crueler than I had ever imagined. Because whatever we had captured, it wasn't just an animal. And I knew deep down that we hadn't won anything. I thought the first capture would harden me, but it did something stranger. It made the borders of reality soft. After Yellowstone, I walked through airports and motor pools, feeling as if the world wore a paper mask, and I could see the scenes where it was glued together. Coffee tasted wrong. The laughter in the barracks sounded like it came from a different room. And the forest, any forest, felt like a locked building where I'd been given a counterfeit key. For a while, our orders were dull, almost merciful. We checked reports of oversized tracks that turned out to be muddy, smears from a limping bear. We listened to shaky campfire stories that unraveled under daylight. The unit called it chasing echoes. But even echoes have a source. And in the fall of 1997, the source finally answered. The call came from a sheriff's office buried in the folds of the Appalachians, where farms stitched the hills like patchwork, and the woods grew thick as a rumor you can't shake. Night screams, people said, not howls, not cats. Screams that turned cattle mean and made porch lights burn until dawn. Then livestock started disappearing, not dragged through a fence line, lifted, whole bodies gone as if somebody erased them with a clean hand. I met the sheriff in a half-lit office, smelling of wet coats and burnt coffee. He didn't tell jokes to hide the fear. He rested both hands on the desk like the wood might slide away. A deputy brought maps with circles inked in red, empty pastures, ruined pens. A creek bed where something large had stepped and left prints like a dog's only wrong. The pads too wide, the nails too long, the stride too human. The sheriff leaned closer and spoke in the steady voice of a man who buried loved ones with his own hands. If this is a prank, it's the kind that eats. We put our base deep in the forest, far from back roads and curious teenagers. Here the woods had weight. The air clung to skin. Moss climbed everything that stood still long enough to host it. Under that canopy, the daylight shrank, more green than white, and sounds came from directions that didn't make sense to the ear. Thermal optics were less useful in the wet haze. We laid sensors instead, little metal nerves we pushed into the soil to listen for what the forest wouldn't show. 2 days passed on a diet of broken branches and the stink of old meat. We found a grotto with a roof of stone and a floor furred with matted hair, the kind that carries a musk you can't wash out of your clothes. Bones lay everywhere. Some were long and hollow with notches where teeth had worried them to splinters. Among deer vertebrae and the chewed crescent of a cow's pelvis, we found a heel of a boot and fabric that might have once been denim, stiff with time and rot. I told myself it blew in. I told myself a lot of things. At night, it patrolled our perimeter with a patience that felt personal. We heard weight move in the brush, sudden as a door slamming, and then nothing. When we sat down in Washington, the air was different. Heavy, wet, ancient. Olympic wasn't a forest so much as a cathedral that forgot to name its god. The trees rose like pillars carved before memory, their trunks furred with moss that draped and dripped as though the forest itself was exhaling. Ferns reached waist-high, fat and prehistoric, and mist clung to every surface like a second skin. You could smell the earth in layers, wet stone, decomposed wood, the faint sweetness of mushrooms breaking down the dead. Our orders were already waiting. We didn't march in like soldiers this time. We dissolved into the timber, 3 teams, observation only. Patience would be the weapon. The higher-ups wanted a juvenile. That word kept ringing in my head like a wrong note on a piano. Not a specimen, not a subject, a juvenile, and they wanted it alive. The first week we hardly moved. We set up on ridges overlooking a valley stitched with streams and cliffs. We wired sensors into the ground, placed microphones where the moss was thick enough to hide them, and then we watched. 12 men, silent as carved wood, listening to a forest that didn't know it had been bugged. On the 3rd day we saw them, through the lens, through the fog, through the patience of hours. Not shadows this time, not guesses. A family, 3 shapes moving together with an ease that mocked our caution. The male, huge, shoulders like fallen trees, his coat dark as river rock. The female, smaller, lighter in color, carrying herself with a gravity that was unmistakably protective. And the young one, reckless in its steps, climbing deadfalls, yanking at branches, splashing water until the mother pulled it back. I'd seen things I could not name in Yellowstone. I'd faced the nightmare in the Appalachian Ravine. But this was different. Watching them was like opening a book you didn't know you owned and realizing the handwriting looked too much like your own. They weren't surviving. They were living, sharing food, building nests, teaching. I saw the mother dig roots, then press them into the small one's hand. It mimicked her failing and hurled dirt in frustration. She nudged it gently with her palm, a gesture any human mother might have made. The order never changed. Capture the juvenile, secure the asset. But around our campfires, if you can call the dim red glow of chem, sticks a campfire, men shifted. Jokes dried in throats. Even Grant chewed slower, as if weighing not the mission, but the line between soldier and thief. On the 5th day, the trap was sprung. One squad moved high, using a speaker to play back a low growl, a sound modeled from the Yellowstone. Audio we'd recorded years earlier, meant to mimic a rival male. It worked. The giant bolted, shoulders crashing trees, answering the phantom threat with a roar that made my earpiece crackle. That was our cue. The female reacted instantly, shoving the young one behind her, lips peeled back, a vibration rolling out of her chest that we felt more than heard. 4 darts fired, hissing through the mist. 2 struck her side, 1 in the thigh, 1 in the shoulder. She staggered but did not fall. Instead she charged, blind with rage, slamming one of our men into the earth so hard the ground seemed to jump. Her arm swept another aside before the drugs took her balance. She fell to one knee, reaching still for her child. The young one shrieked, a sound that didn't belong to animals or humans, something in between, frantic and breaking. Nets dropped over it. Its small hands clawed, pulling, yanking, but the cords tangled tighter. I was close enough to see its eyes, wide, gold brown, wet with a fear too human to dismiss. I wanted to cut it free. My fingers twitched toward the knife at my belt, but the weight of command pressed on me like a boot to the chest. Then the roar returned, louder, angrier. The father was back. His steps thundered through the valley, shaking bark loose, snapping limbs with each stride. I will never forget that sound. It wasn't a roar of fury. It was grief weaponized, a sound that made you feel small for being human. We had seconds. Orders crackled through the comms. Secure the juvenile, retreat. No mention of the mother slumping into the moss. No thought for the giant racing toward us, with the whole forest breaking in his wake. We hauled the net, the small body inside thrashing, squealing, coughing. I glanced back once. The mother stretched out a trembling hand toward her child. And then the father burst onto the clearing, his cry tearing the mist into ribbons. He didn't chase us. He fell to her side, dropping to his knees, cradling her face in his massive hand, as though she were porcelain. His roar turned into a sound I still can't name. Not rage, not warning. Something closer to the wordless plea of a world being broken apart. We ran with the net, branches whipping our faces, lungs burning, while behind us the valley howled like a wound that would never close. When the helicopter came, its blades hammered the mist flat, scattering it into gray sheets. We loaded the juvenile in silence. It had stopped fighting, stopped screaming, and only trembled against the mesh as the drugs finally took hold. Its fur smelled of milk and moss and panic. The sound of the father carried through the trees, even over the engine noise. I will hear it until the day I die. We didn't speak on the flight back. No one met each other's eyes. The box they used for the juvenile was smaller, cleaner, fitted with locks that clicked too neatly. It rattled once, then fell still. We all heard the quiet whimper from inside, and for a second I wished the rotors would fail and drop us into the sea so that none of us would have to deliver what we carried. The mission was called a success, but what we brought back wasn't a trophy. It was a theft. And in the silence after, each of us knew we had crossed into something no uniform or metal could wash clean. When we landed back at base, the juvenile was taken from us. No debrief in the usual sense, no congratulations, just white coats and armed escorts who moved like undertakers. We stood on the tarmac, the dawn just breaking over the hangars, and listened to the rattle of chains and the hiss of hydraulics as they lowered the container into a truck that didn't bear insignia. It drove away without headlights, swallowed by the gray, and with it went the last thread of innocence any of us had. They called the operation a triumph. The reports dressed it in language clean enough for archives. Subject secured, minimal casualties, no civilian exposure. What the reports did not hold was the sound that chased us through the valley, the father's scream echoing across rock and water, a sound that made us feel like children breaking something they couldn't rebuild. They didn't record how the mother's hand trembled toward her child even as the drugs took her down. They didn't write the silence that followed inside the helicopter, where men stared at their boots as though the leather itself accused them. I was promoted not long after. Paperwork and planning replaced mud and moss. I thought maybe distance would numb it, but it didn't. Distance just gave me a broader view of the machine I was a cog inside. From headquarters I saw the maps, the flight paths, the endless requisition forms for drugs and containment units. And I saw the files. 3 facilities tucked behind cover stories. Caldera in Yellowstone, Citadel in the Appalachians, and the Ark in Alaska, the deepest, the coldest, the one they never spoke of above a whisper. Each was a warehouse for what we had stolen from the wild. In 2000, they let me tour Caldera under the pretense of inspection. I wish they hadn't. Behind glass thicker than tank armor sat the giant from Yellowstone. IG Codis, my first operation, the one who had looked at us with weary understanding as the drugs pulled him under. He was still alive, but not living. His fur had dulled, falling out in patches. His frame, once a storm of muscle, sagged like wet rope. He didn't move, didn't rage. He sat against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing, a monarch reduced to a husk. The scientist who led the tour beamed as he spoke of muscle regeneration trials, pain tolerance studies, stress response metrics. He spoke with the pride of a man showing off a broken tool he had bent into compliance. I wanted to break his teeth. Later, I asked about the juvenile, the one we'd ripped from the Olympic Valley. They told me without flinching that it hadn't survived. For months, it had refused to eat, crying out in a voice that scraped the walls until its body gave out. The phrase in the report was acute stress syndrome leading to multi-organ failure. The truth was simpler. It died of grief. A child, stolen, starved not of food, but of the only faces it trusted. That night I couldn't breathe. I sat in my quarters staring at the wall, and all I saw were eyes, the father's as he fell to his knees, the mother's as she reached out, the child's as the net pulled tight, eyes that no dart could shut. I knew then that whatever uniform I wore, I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a poacher with better funding. I filed my resignation in 2001. They didn't stop me this time. Grant called me in, his face as flat and cold as stone. He reminded me of my oath, the secrecy I had signed into blood. He told me the government had long arms and a longer memory. It wasn't advice. It was a threat. But I left anyway. Bought a small house in Montana. Lived near the timberline where the air was thin and the nights were full of stars. I told myself I'd grow quiet, become invisible. And for 20 years I did. But quiet doesn't erase. Every night when I closed my eyes, I saw them again. The ravine in the Appalachians, Miller's body bent in the creek, the child trembling in its net, the giant slumped in his cage. The memories pressed against me like roots under a floor, warping everything above them. I tried to forget, but forgetting is a choice the mind doesn't always honor. Now I am older. My oath expired in every way that matters. My body is slowing, but my conscience has sharpened. And I cannot let this truth remain buried, because the world you think you know is a costume stitched from lies. The forests are not empty. The mountains are not silent. There are others here, ancient as stone, older than our flags and our laws. The government knows. Not only knows, but hunts, cages, and dissects. They'd call it research. They'd call it control. But what it is desecration. I have nothing left to lose, which makes me dangerous in a way I never was with a rifle in my hand. I speak now because someone must. Because maybe, if the truth leaks like water through stone, these beings, call them whatever name you want, will not vanish into laboratories and unmarked graves. Maybe someone will listen. I don't expect forgiveness. Not from them. Not from you. I only ask that when you step into a forest and hear the sudden hush, when you catch the sense of eyes on you that no lens can capture, you remember this. We are not the first owners of this land. We are tenants at best, and tenants can be evicted. That is what keeps me awake. Not the screams, not the cages, not even the threats whispered by men in uniforms. What haunts me most is the thought that one day, the silence in those forests will break. And when it does, it will not be us doing the hunting.